The first time I saw the house, I knew it had a story. Cracked walls, paint peeling in lazy curls, weeds pushing through old cement, it looked forgotten. But in that silence, there was potential. It sat in the middle of the capital city, prime location, impossible price. The previous owners were family friends who had left the country 3 years ago, desperate for quick cash. So, when they offered to sell, I didn't hesitate. It was mine now, my first real home. The first day I moved in, I felt like I was stepping into someone else's memory. There was dust everywhere, faint outlines on the walls where frames had once hung, and the echo of old life clinging to every corner. It was peaceful in a way, but that peace didn't last long. When I arrived with my boxes and my dogs, I noticed something odd. A motorcycle was parked inside my garage. Not near it, inside it. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process it. The place hadn't even been mine for 24 hours, and someone was already treating it like a public parking lot. I didn't say a word. I just dragged the bike outside and left it on the street. Later that day, I had a proper gate installed. That evening, just as the last rays of sun slid behind the neighboring roofs, there was a loud, angry knock on the new gate. Metal against metal. I didn't open it. Through the window, I saw a man in his late 60s, face red and tight with fury, pacing like a dog denied entry. After 15 minutes of frustration, he gave up, muttering to himself, and wheeled the bike away. That was my first impression of my neighbor. And I should have trusted it. For the next week, things settled. No more uninvited guests. Just me, my 3 dogs, and the sound of drills and paint rollers as I slowly turned that forgotten house into a home. But there was something off about the neighborhood. People looked at me like I didn't belong, not because I was new, but because I'd broken some unspoken rule. I found out later what that rule was: this house was supposed to stay empty. The man next door, the same one with the bike, had been telling everyone the place was abandoned. He'd even used parts of the property like it was his own. But that illusion was gone now, and he didn't like it. About a week later, I was taking a shower when I noticed something strange. The water pressure was weaker than usual. Not a big deal, at least not until I heard it. A low, rhythmic hum coming from next door. A water pump. I paused. The sound was too close, too synchronized with my own pipes. I waited. When the noise stopped, I turned off my tap and reopened it a few seconds later, and just like that, the pressure was back. Coincidence? Maybe. But it didn't feel like one. The next few days, I paid attention. I tested the taps. Waited for the pump. Compared pressure. Every time his pump ran, my pressure dropped. Every single time. That's when it hit me. This man wasn't just a bad neighbor, he was stealing my water. The realization burned through me like acid. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My friends, the previous owners, once mentioned their water bills had been oddly high, even though no one lived here for years. They assumed it was just old leaks in the pipes. But now, I knew. Somewhere between those years of abandonment, this old man had waltzed onto my property and connected his pipes to mine. He wasn't just stealing water, he was stealing from the very veins of my home. At first, I didn't know what to do. The logical part of me said, let it go. Water's cheap. $5 a month isn't worth a fight. But this wasn't about money. It was about principle. Someone had invaded my space. Used my resources. And now, he was acting like I was the intruder. The idea of confronting him crossed my mind, but there's no reasoning with people like him. The kind who see kindness as weakness. So I decided I'd bide my time. Let him think he was winning. Because I was already planning something that would make him regret ever crossing that line. For the next few days, I lived like a detective in my own house. Every sound, every drip, every change in pressure, I tracked it like a hunter tracing footprints. Each time I turned on a tap, I listened for the faint echo of his pump switching on. Each time it did, my anger simmered just a little hotter. And then one night, as I sat in my dimly lit kitchen with a mug of tea, the truth sank in so deeply it made my stomach twist. This wasn't just a random fluke, this man had been stealing from me for years, long before I even knew this place existed. It wasn't just water anymore. It was disrespect. It was entitlement. It was someone looking at another person's property and thinking, mine. I wanted to confront him. I imagined the scene dozens of times. Me, standing at his gate, voice calm but heavy with restrained fury, "You've been stealing from me." And him, pretending not to know what I meant. Feigning confusion. Acting like the old, harmless neighbor who just didn't realize. But I knew how that would end. People like him never confess. They manipulate, deflect, and guilt you into silence. No, confrontation would only give him warning. He'd cover his tracks, patch up the connection, pretend he'd done nothing wrong. And I didn't want to fight. I wanted justice. That night, lying in bed with my dogs at my feet, I stared at the ceiling fan and thought about how people justify theft. He probably told himself it didn't matter. That the house had been empty, that nobody was using it. That he was borrowing. It's amazing how greed wears the mask of logic. It wasn't even about the cost. Water in my country is cheap, unbelievably cheap. $5 a month for everything, the garden, the car wash, 3 dogs, and household chores. Even with his theft, the bill barely moved. But I couldn't let it go. Because I'd worked for this home. Every square inch of it. Every drop of water that flowed through these pipes. And the idea that someone thought they could help themselves without even asking, it clawed at something deep inside me. It wasn't the money. It was the principle. The violation. The quiet arrogance of thinking you can take what isn't yours, and that no one will ever notice. I kept observing him. In the evenings, I'd hear the pump kick in for longer and longer. Sometimes at odd hours, midnight, 2 a.m. It made sense. With tenants on the upper floors, he needed to fill the rooftop tanks regularly. And the old man, with his outdated wiring and lazy repairs, was cutting corners every way he could. But what he didn't realize was that I had stopped seeing him as a nuisance. Now, he was a project. I thought about going legal, but in my country, bureaucracy moves slower than rust. A police report would go nowhere. A court case? Years. Meanwhile, he'd still be there, smug and dry while my water pressure danced to the rhythm of his pump. No, I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't even need a wrench. All I needed was patience. Over the next few days, I tested something. Each time his pump came on, I'd go to my main valve, the one controlling my house's water supply, and turn it off for a few seconds. Then I'd turn it back on. The result? A sudden drop in surge in pressure, and his pump whining from next door like a machine gasping for air. The sound was music. That's when I realized something crucial: if I could starve his pump of water long enough while it was running, it would burn out. He'd built his entire comfort, his tenants' comfort, on stolen water. And that comfort was about to vanish. But I didn't want to just destroy the pump. I wanted him to feel what I'd felt. The slow, gnawing frustration. The loss of control. The humiliation of realizing you've been caught and can't do a thing about it. I wanted him to experience that same helplessness, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you were entitled to. So I waited for the right moment. Monday morning. The start of a new week. The perfect day to ruin someone's routine. I sat by my kitchen window, pretending to read, one ear trained on that familiar hum. At exactly 10:07 a.m., his pump started up. I could almost imagine him on the other side of the wall, sipping tea, thinking nothing of it. And that's when I stood up, walked over to the main valve, and placed my hand on it. It felt cold under my fingers. Quiet. Powerful. With one simple twist, I turned it off. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hum next door deepened, struggling against the vacuum. I turned off the valve completely and walked back inside, pretending it was just another day. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. he'd made his life easy at my expense for years. And now, his entire world was running dry. I turned the valve off and walked back to the kitchen like a man who'd only paused to make tea. My heart beat a steady drum, not from fear, but from the cool, mechanical certainty that I had set something in motion. The house felt too quiet for a few seconds, like the silence before an old radio crackles to life. Then, from next door, the pump's hum changed. It stopped being a background noise and became something strained, a machine trying to breathe through a straw. The sound climbed and climbed, a high, whining note that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't immediate fireworks. Revenge rarely is. It's a slow, mechanical crescendo that builds until something finally gives. I watched the water gauge on my side to be sure my action had the intended effect. The tank's level stayed stubbornly low. The float valve, the little brass sentinel up on the roof, stayed open, waiting for water that wouldn't arrive. Down the street, the pump kept eating electricity, fighting to do a job it now had no chance of finishing. At first it was only the noise. After an hour, the thin whining turned into a keening machine, then a guttural grinding, and then a metallic snap. Somewhere inside that house, the pump began to seize. I could imagine the internal bearings seizing, pistons overheating, seals giving way. It was a mechanical death, brutal but elegant in its own way. A smell started to seep over the wall, a faint, chemical tang that made my nose wrinkle. Burning insulation. That sick, acrid scent that tells you electricity is failing. The lights in the neighborhood flickered. I paused mid-sip of my tea and watched the bulbs above the stove stutter like dying fireflies. Then, with a low pop, everything went dark next door. It was quiet for a heartbeat, then the noise burst back, not from his pump but from his house, shouts, slamming doors, frantic footsteps across planks that hadn't seen new nails in years. I pressed my ear to the window and heard muffled panicked voices, the kind that carry only a single emotion, confusion turning quickly into anger. A tenant's voice rose. Why is there no power? Why is there no water? We were sleeping, we paid. Another one screamed for the landlord. The old man's voice, small and brittle, called back, trying to sound in control. But the control was gone. I could hear the climb of desperation in him, short, repeated sentences stitched together like a man trying to hold the seams of a coat together as the wind rips it apart. By midnight, the situation hadn't stabilized. Tenants banged on doors, cursed, and called friends. The smell of burnt wiring intensified. I imagined the wiring harness where the pump was connected, ancient cloth-insulated cables, varnish cracked from years of heat and neglect, now red-hot from a motor running dry and hungry for water. Where modern homes have safety cutoffs, his house had duct-tape solutions and compromises. Those compromises were about to cost him everything. At 3 a.m, the building's fuse box couldn't take it anymore. A loud, metallic snap, then the final pop of a fuse blowing, snapped through my window like a gunshot. The house shuddered into silence. No pump. No lights. No fans. Nobody sleeping comfortably anymore. Somewhere between the shouts and the clatter, I felt a curious calm. It was not triumph in the cartoonish sense. I didn't do a victory dance or fist pump. It was cleaner than that, the raw satisfaction of equilibrium restored. A wrong had been balanced. By dawn, the neighborhood was awake. Word travels fast in small streets. People stood on the pavement, arms crossed, muttering. By mid-morning, 2 of his tenants had already packed and left. They moved quickly, a hasty exodus of suitcases and anger, their faces hard with the sore of betrayal that landlords don't truly understand until it's their loss. A day later, the police arrived. I watched from behind my curtains as officers walked into his home, clipboards in hand. Tenants had filed complaints: no water, no power, dangerous wiring. In our system, essential services are protected, landlords are legally obligated to provide safe living conditions. The law moves differently when it's about someone's livelihood. Fines are levied quickly to protect tenants, and in this case, the penalties were heavy. The landlord was issued a fine, forced to refund security deposits, and labeled non-compliant until repairs were done. I say it like bullet points now because the reality is messy. He lost his tenants, the people who paid his rent and kept his modest life afloat. Without them, he had no income. He had to move in with his daughter. For a retired mechanic who had fashioned his life around small, predictable routines, that was a collapse you could measure in the hollow of his face. A few days after the blackout, he came to my gate. I opened the door and met him on the step. He looked smaller in the sunlight than he had through the window. His shoulders hunched as if carrying a sack of shame. He asked, with a voice that tried and failed to be casual, "Did you turn off your water? We lost ours and our power keeps tripping. Maybe you did something when you were fixing your pipes." I looked at him for a long moment. Up close, his eyes were the same tired amber as a dog's, loyal but wary. There were little lines at the corners. Time had softened him in some ways, and hardened him in others. I said, flatly, "There was a leak in my tank. I turned it off until the plumber came." He nodded like a man relieved to have an answer because it would give him a path back to what he used to have, things working, life continuing. He didn't ask more. He didn't press. He walked away. The expression on his face was the most telling thing. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defiance. It was a flicker of something like understanding, or maybe just the dawning of a calculation, how fragile the little advantages he'd carved out of other people's lives really were. It's one thing to steal a little water when you think you can get away with it. It's another to feel the floor drop beneath all your comforts in a single, silent move you can't fight back against. There was no gloating on my part. When the tenants left, some neighbors muttered that I'd been cruel. Others glanced at the empty windows of his house and nodded, as if the removal of a petty thief had restored a kind of balance to the street. Later, I hired a plumber. I did it openly. He saw the receipt when he came by to peek at the repairs I was having done. I had the old pipes checked and any illicit connections removed. I documented everything, not because I wanted to drag him through court, but because I wanted proof in case he tried to pin blame on me. I had concrete evidence, photographs of pipework, plumber invoices, and a clean, legal trail showing I had acted responsibly. That's another thing, I never needed to lie about it. The truth, when told simply, carries its own weight. He could have fixed what he'd done and faced the consequences quietly. Instead, he had let negligence and cheapness fester, and found that the price of that disease was far higher than the money he thought he'd saved. For a long time after, I slept well. Not because I destroyed a man's life for sport, but because I defended the home I'd worked for. The house I bought cheap because someone needed cash, the one I'd brought back to life, deserved someone who would protect it. There's a strange moral clarity that comes when you remove the emotional fog from an injustice. My actions were surgical, not angry. I didn't set out to ruin a life, I set out to stop theft. The consequences, severe as they were the natural fallout of a man's choices and the system that allowed him to take advantage. By the end of that week, the neighborhood felt different. The empty rooms next door were hollow and echoing, you could hear the wind through unoccupied halls. People looked at me differently now, some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled resentment, others with a quiet gratitude. There are neighborhood politics you don't see until the balance shifts. And yet, even as the house settled and my plumbing was made secure, I couldn't help turning it over in my head. Did I go too far? Was the punishment proportional to the crime? The more I replayed it, the clearer it became, entitlement compounds. The man had been taking what wasn't his for years, building a life on other people's neglect. My small, decisive action didn't create his ruin, it exposed the instability his choices were already hiding. When he finally moved to his daughter's place, he left empty-handed and oddly quiet. No fury, no threats. Just resignation. I imagine he thought constantly about the thin lines that had kept his life running, a tenant paying rent, a pump humming at night, wires held together by hope. That fragile architecture collapsed the instant it was tested. In the days after, strangers on the street asked me, sometimes with a bluntness I had come to expect, "Did you do it?" I would answer in the same way I'd answered him, "There was a leak. I turned it off." It was both evasive and true. Some people accepted that. Others didn't need convincing. This is the thing about revenge, it's not always dramatic in the moment. Often it's a ripple. You do something small and legal, a single twist or decision, and watch the world rearrange itself until consequences land where they belong. The satisfying part is not the collapse itself but the restoration, the house no longer being siphoned, the taps running steady when I asked them to, the dogs having the clean water they needed without the nervousness that comes when the pressure drops mid-bath. That night I sat on the roof, watching the skyline split into orange and blue, listening to the city breathe. The house felt like mine in a way that went beyond ownership, it felt protected. Part of me thought of the old man in the same way you think about a fixed, dangerous machine. You don't curse it, you disconnect it. And somewhere, that felt just enough. For a few weeks, silence settled over the street. The house next door, once alive with the chatter of tenants and the whir of that infernal pump, was now just another piece of urban decay, quiet, empty, hollow. The only sound that lingered was the rustle of dry leaves scraping across the concrete, like whispers from a story already told. I didn't see the old man much after that. Neighbors said he'd moved in with his daughter on the outskirts of the city, just for a while, but everyone knew what that meant. When someone's pride breaks that completely, they don't come back. Still, every time I passed his empty gate, I thought about how easy it had been to end it all. One turn of a valve. One simple correction to years of theft. It made me realize something I hadn't expected: power doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers. In the following days, I had my plumber come by to fix the plumbing properly. We went through the entire line, inch by inch, until we found where the theft had been happening. A thin, sneaky pipe had been welded into my supply line, running discreetly through the ground into his property. It had been there for years, cleverly disguised under the boundary wall. When the plumber saw it, he shook his head and said quietly, "Whoever did this, they planned it." And that sentence stuck with me. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't desperation. It was deliberate greed. He'd gone through the trouble of carving into someone else's property just to save a few coins. And when you think about it that way, what I did wasn't cruel. It was justice, clean and calculated, a mirror held up to his own behavior. The police visit that followed his tenant complaints ended up becoming the talk of the lane. People who once avoided me started nodding in acknowledgement. A few whispered that I'd taught him a lesson. Others said nothing at all, but their expressions carried quiet approval, the kind that doesn't need words. No one missed the man who treated his neighbors like resources to exploit. One afternoon, about 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my yard when a delivery boy approached with a small envelope. Inside was a receipt, proof of the fine the old man had paid. Attached was a note written in shaky, uneven handwriting. It said, "Guess I should have fixed things properly when I had the chance." There was no signature. He didn't need one. I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer of my desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Because revenge isn't always about rage. Sometimes it's about closure. I think about him sometimes. I picture him sitting on a quiet veranda somewhere outside the city, watching rain collect in buckets because he no longer trusts pipes or pumps. Maybe he learned. Maybe he didn't. But that part isn't up to me. What mattered was that I learned something too. I learned that boundaries matter, not just the kind built with brick and concrete, but the invisible ones made of respect. And when someone crosses them, you don't always need to shout or swing back. Sometimes all it takes is a small, precise move that lets the universe do the rest. My house feels different now. When I turn on the tap, the water flows steady and strong. The pressure feels right, balanced, fair, like the quiet hum of justice restored. Every drop that falls into my sink reminds me of one thing: people like him count on others to stay silent. They think politeness is weakness. But every now and then, they meet someone who knows how to stay calm long enough to strike clean. And that's exactly what I did. If there's one truth I took away from all of this, it's that revenge doesn't have to be cruel. It just has to be clear. You don't destroy someone's life, you simply stop them from taking what isn't theirs. And when they finally have to face the cost of their own actions, that's the sweetest kind of justice. So no, I don't feel guilty. Not when I water my garden. Not when my dogs drink from their bowls. Not when I stand under a strong, steady shower knowing that every drop is mine. I didn't ruin a man's life. I just stopped letting him siphon mine. If this story gave you chills or made you think twice about how karma works, hit that like button. It tells me you believe in justice done right. Tell me in the comments, have you ever caught someone stealing something small, but it felt huge to stop them? And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories where karma does the talking. Because sometimes, all it takes is one turn of the valve.